shield Israel from the laws that are meant to deny weapons for human rights violators? Let's get to the bottom line. The United States is the world's biggest supplier of weapons. Decades ago, laws were put into place to prevent the supply of those weapons to countries that commit, quote, gross violations of human rights. Perhaps the most famous of those laws is the Leahy Law of 1997, named after its lead sponsor, former Senator Patrick Leahy. And just this past February, after months of Israel's war in Gaza, the Biden administration published a national security memorandum. That's known as NSM-20, and it requires the State Department to report to Congress on whether it finds that Israel is credible when it makes assurances that its uses of U.S. weapons do not violate U.S. law or international law. So what are the requirements of those U.S. laws when it arms other countries? And are these mechanisms applied equally across the world, especially when it comes to Israel? Today we're speaking with Stephanie Kirschgessner, Deputy Head of Investigations for The Guardian U.S., and Stephen Rickard, a distinguished fellow in the Human Rights Institute at Georgetown University's Law Center. Let me read something to you. This is the Leahy Law. The Leahy Law says no assistance shall be furnished to any unit of the security forces of a foreign country if the Secretary of State has credible information that such unit has committed a gross violation of human rights. Steffi, you just did a deep dive into the Leahy Law and its practice and the use of it as applied to Israel. What did you find?
Well, generally, my findings were that the Leahy Law, as many experts have said to me, is not being really followed or executed in terms of Israel, and that somehow, even though it applies to many countries, including U.S. allies or especially U.S. allies, that it's not, for some reason, even though there are significant reports of gross and allegations of gross violations of human rights, that somehow it's not affecting Israel. And my reporting really took me, I spoke to a lot of former officials and I saw State Department documents, and I really concluded that there are special policies in place.
They're like mechanisms, right?
Mechanisms, yes. These are sort of deep in the procedures of the State Department that basically give Israel an out, and that these do not exist for any other countries or allies.
Can you share with us a few of these mechanisms that you found?
Yeah, sure. So there are basically three that I found. First, because the way the process works is all the different, groups within the State Department or departments that are looking at an incident have to agree that a gross violation of human rights has occurred. That is not applied to anyone else. So in other instances, there can be a staff finding that this has happened. There doesn't need to be this broad consensus.
And that broad, as I read your article, it was, different bureaus and agencies in the State Department, even our embassy, all have to come into agreement and alignment that an abuse has occurred.
Yes. So why does this exist only for Israel? The second case is that Israel is notified when such a review is occurring and of the specific allegation, and they have 90 days to respond. So as one former official put it, this is just delaying the process. No other country gets this kind of notification. Now, to be fair, in my discussions with the State Department, they said, look, we discuss with a lot of countries. Like, there are discussions that go on. It's not that it never happens. However... But
there's a formalized process with Israel with a 90-day return.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And then the third mechanism?
And then the third mechanism, which is, in plain sight, is that the Leahy Law has been updated over the years in Congress. Congress has updated it. And in 2021, there were a bunch of countries that signed new kind of agreements within the Leahy Law agreement. So I looked at, more than a dozen of them, and only in the case of Israel is there language that says, in which both, an Israeli official and the Israeli ambassador, in fact, and a U.S. official, senior U.S. official, has signed off saying Israel has a robust, independent legal system, including its military justice system. So why is that important? It's important because it allows Israel to say, look, this violation may have happened, or some might believe that it happened, but we have the capability as a strong democracy with a strong justice system to take care of it. And essentially, the United States government has said, yes, that's the case.
So what I'm hearing from you, to put it in layperson language, is the Israeli military courts are their own judge and jury.
Well, I think that the U.S. government's saying we believe that it's independent, that it's that essentially they can review their own potential misdeeds.
Steve, I think our audience knows, I think most people in the world know, America is the biggest arms sales entity in the world. I did not realize that there were as many filters and constraints on U.S. weapons sales as there were. It was interesting to read that, in fact, we do have a system and that the Leahy law has mattered in many, many, many cases. Can you give us a sense of the application of the law, the scale of it, and has it applied to Israel in the same way as it has applied to many other nations?
Sure. Well, first, we need to distinguish a little bit between arms sales and military assistance. What we're really talking about here is U.S. taxpayer-funded dollars being given to other countries, not they're purchasing weapons here. And what Senator Leahy said toward the end of the 90s, when other human rights laws just didn't seem to be coming into force, they just weren't being put in place or actually implemented, was he said, well, if we have to be in these countries, and if you think engagement in these countries is so important, and you tell us there's just a few bad apples in the barrel, then let's agree to a minimum floor. And that minimum floor has 4 parts. If we have credible information that a specific unit, a battalion, a company, a division, is committing the worst human rights abuses and nothing is being done about it, let's at least not give taxpayer-funded military aid or training to those specific units. And that's what the Leahy law requires. People need to understand the scope of American military assistance. We give tens of billions of dollars away to other countries. It's fundamental to our national security strategy at the moment to have a light footprint by building up the forces in country and partnering with them. And so the Leahy law just says, okay, if you're going to do that, and if we have the information that there are bad units doing the worst possible things, let's quarantine those units and not work with those units. Now, this law has been applied in scores of countries, thousands of times, literally thousands of times. But so far as we're aware, in no case has the State Department ever been willing to apply it to Israel, even in cases where the human rights community was pretty clear that there was credible information that a gross human rights violation had occurred.
Steve, I had Senator Chris Van Hollen on this show recently, and he said we're seeing textbook war crimes every day on the television. We're able to see this in real time, in real visuals, and this is happening. We've seen Senator Bernie Sanders and others basically come out and talk about the dangers of being complicit in what's going on. And so as I read Stephanie's piece on the history of the application of the Leahy law with regards to Israel, it seems like that law was set up to try to prevent, in fact, that complicity that Senator Sanders and Senator Van Hollen have been worried about. So what has gone off the rails here from your perspective?
Well, I think Stephanie's superb article really does lay out a lot of the problems. Now, and I should say, this isn't completely unique to Israel. There is a bias in the Department of Defense and in the State Department toward engagement. There's a bias against having fights with other countries. And so, for instance, it took a decade before the State Department would apply the recently adopted law on child soldiers. I mean, everybody got a waiver for a whole decade just because they don't want to fight with other countries. They don't want to have, they've got lots of interests, et cetera. So it's been hard to apply this law in many cases. But in other cases, despite those difficulties, in Pakistan, in Nigeria, in Colombia, the State Department eventually has been able to apply it. Now, sometimes what they'll do is they'll say, and this is relevant to the point about consensus, they'll say, all right, you don't agree, you don't think the information, you, the Defense Department, don't think the information is credible. You, the embassy, are arguing that the case, the criminal proceedings that took place were adequate to deal with the problem. We don't agree. We, the Human Rights Bureau, don't agree. We, the Political Military Affairs Bureau at the State Department, don't agree. Let's just suspend the unit. we won't agree that it's ineligible for all future purposes, but let's not go forward with the training exercise. Let's not go forward with the aid. That happens about 10 times for every one time they actually say, this is a unit that's on the ineligible list. It's quarantined. And so if you put in place for Israel, as Stephanie's article documents, a requirement that everyone agree, you are, just from the start, you're taking out of the Leahy law about 9 out of every 10 cases where the law had, in other cases, been effective.
We just had, Steve, 4 cases, as I understand it. I may have the numbers wrong, but 4 units that were identified recently in Israel of having committed gross violations, human rights violations, and abuses. And Secretary of State Anthony Blinken determined in those cases that the actions taken by the Israelis were enough to basically forestall any action that we did in sort of decertifying their. This seemed to be very, very controversial in human rights groups. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, Stephanie mentioned that there's this provision in the agreement with Israel that says up front, we think that Israel's judiciary is independent and robust. Here's the same agreement for Greece. Doesn't say anything like that. As far as I know, Greece has a robust and independent judicial system, but they didn't think it was necessary to say that in the agreement with the government of Greece. The fact is that there have been very serious concerns about the independence of the Israeli military judicial system. And to be clear, it's fair to make distinctions between countries. I mean, Israel does have a relatively independent judiciary and press compared to many other countries where the United States is working. But that doesn't mean it's perfect any more than our courts are perfect or our system of military justice always gets it right. And there have been very serious concerns that have been raised not only outside of Israel by human rights groups, but by credible voices within Israel, including a panel of senior retired Israeli judges who looked at the military justice system some years ago and had a series of critiques that prosecutors, for instance, weren't sufficiently independent of the chain of command so they could be influenced. So it's not to say that Israel doesn't have, compared to many other countries that we're in, a better judicial system, but that doesn't mean that it gets it right or that adequate punishments have been handed down so that you can find under the Leahy law that effective steps have been taken.
Stephanie, one of the pieces in your article where we kind of referred to obliquely, but you actually put a word and term to it as an institutionalization of this process, and you're the first to report about it, as I understand it, is the Israel Leahy Vetting Forum, which is part of the organized structure of decision-making. I'd love to hear more about that, but also with regards to cases that do rise. And you go through a litany of cases of individuals that were essentially murdered in extrajudicial killings found by both sides, etc., with no penalties, etc. We had the killing of a colleague of ours, Shireen Abu Akleh, who was also one of these cases that rose to the very top of the Israeli justice system and review, and also the U.S. system. No militants in the area, shot in the head, etc., and another of these cases. I'd love to hear about some of these cases that you investigated, but also the Israeli Leahy Vetting Forum.
Well, yeah, to your point, I mean, it's disturbing, to say the least, that among the cases that I mentioned in my reporting, 2 involve American citizens. Your colleague, Shireen Abu Akleh, and also Omar Assad, who was a 78-year-old who died in police custody, and he had lived in the United States for many, many years. So there, I think it really raises the question of where, why the U.S. government, why the State Department is not taking greater actions, at least on behalf of its own, citizens under these circumstances. The Israel Leahy Vetting Forum was essentially created because there are certain countries, and Israel is one of them, where there is so much military assistance given that is actually difficult to track. The State Department.
So they did it as a tracking mechanism, not as a mechanism of overall concern that this could be a constant problem.
Yeah, my understanding is that it was done because there needs to be some some effort to track these countries. The other countries are Egypt and Ukraine, where there is because the scale of the foreign assistance is so great. And yeah, what I found in my reporting, and I think this is what's kind of the point that a lot of people are making now, is these are all, the instances that have been reviewed in the past that are way before, October 7th. But how has the U.S. government's approach to these things? How has the fact that all these exceptions have been made for Israel, how has that affected the current conduct of the war? And I think that's where where the two things kind of meet.
Well, your article leads to the notion that it leads to impunity. And I think that's some of the people you interviewed. I think it was Josh Paul, other folks that have resigned from State Department roles. They're concerned. These are people not secretary, assistant secretary. They're doing the nuts and bolts of policy making and policy review and policy implementation, some of whom, including Josh Paul, who resigned because they believe it leads to impunity.
Yeah.
Right?
They believe it leads to impunity, and that basically, if you're kind of looking the other way, even when it comes to the murder or suspicious death of your own citizens, then what is really then doesn't that send a message, both on the political level, the government level, but also the individual units that aren't really being held accountable at all. And I think it's all really coming to a head now.
There is this interesting moment right now where President Biden has put on pause the delivery of some weapons. Reportedly, he has put the pause on those weapons because of concerns about how they may be used in Rafah. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I don't know if that's because of National Security Memorandum 20, which Chris Van Hollen had been pushing, or because of the Leahy Law, or Joe Biden just operating with a gut feel. Is there a problem in this when you kind of look at a relationship like this where we're not using law, but we're using gut I'm just interested in this suspension and whether it's an inflection point for a different approach or whether it's a speed bump where the same behaviors continue. Your thoughts, Steve?
Well, when we sell weapons to a country, so we're not taxpayer underwritten, not military aid, but we sell weapons to a country, we actually make that country pay a little bit more than the cost of the weapon to administer the sale and to administer investigations of whether or not the weapons are being used in a way that's consistent with U.S. law. They're not transferred to other countries that we wouldn't have sold them to in the first place. But somehow, when we're actually giving the aid, the idea that we, the American taxpayers, should have the ability to say, well, we support Israel. Israel is an ally. They were attacked. They have a right to defend themselves. But we would like to know how the aid's being used, and if the aid is being used to commit gross human rights violations, we don't want our taxpayer dollars used for that. It's a minimum floor that ought to be applied. But apparently...
Look, I think the big question, Steve and Stephanie, I think the door that Stephanie opened, at least in my mind, reading this incredibly interesting history of the failure to apply this law in the case of Israel, as we apply it elsewhere, is what's the state of the American brand when it comes to human rights? As we talk about human rights violations all around the world, what is the state of America's standing being able to comment on that if, in fact, you have such huge glaring loopholes in the application, even with one of your closest allies?
Yeah, I think the case of Shireen Abu Akleh, and that this is the appropriate place to talk about it. As a journalist myself, it's just so outrageous that there has not been any accountability whatsoever. And again, pointing to really an extreme example of that killing, that it really does do significant damage to an administration or president who swore that this was going to be a really central part of his foreign policy. Where are we seeing that? And I think that there could be a lot, if there was any motion to address those issues, it could go very far away, even a long way, even in individual cases. And by the way, Congress has been calling for it. There are many members of Congress who've been very vocal on that case. and yet we still don't have more information about it.
Steve?
You know, the United States on human rights has both the failure and the virtue of being inconsistent on this issue. That is to say, it at least in some cases does this. It certainly talks a good game, and it's important to reinforce the value of human rights. I mean, we have data for fiscal year 2020. I think that's the last year that I have this data for. And there were 129 units that were found ineligible under the Leahy Law. In that 1 year, 129 units. There were 994 units that were suspended from getting aid. That is to say, we didn't necessarily find them ineligible and put them on the pariah list, but we just said there's enough here that we shouldn't go forward. So that's 1,123 cases in one fiscal year where the Leahy Law stopped taxpayer aid from going forward to units that were credibly alleged to be involved in gross human rights violations. That's not nothing. You can go on the on the State Department website right now and look at a list of countries over the last 5 years. You know, Bangladesh, Belize, Burkina Faso, Burundi, Cambodia, Georgia. You know, the list goes on, where the law has been applied. But then you come to Israel, and clearly there's something going on there. There are cases with credible organizations, clear documentation, gross violations, never been found to fall under the Leahy Law. And I think in terms of the question of a sense of impunity, you can just look at the reaction from the government of Israel to the mere suggestion that one unit might be put on the pariah list. And it's absolutely clear that this was utterly unexpected, and they're pushing back very, very hard. If there's one positive thing that's coming out of this, it's that I used to call the Leahy Law the most important law nobody's ever heard of. Well, now people understand that law exists, and it's there to protect their taxpayer dollars from being used to underwrite human rights abuses, and they want it enforced.
Well, one of the quotes in Stephanie's article, which came directly from Senator Leahy, and we'll conclude here, is that the law has not been applied consistently, and what we have seen in the West Bank and Gaza is a stark example of that. Over many years, I urged successive U.S. administrations to apply the law there, but it has not happened. Stephanie, I'll give you the last word. I mean, this is an amazing quote from the senator who drafted and took this legislation into law. Your quick final thoughts.
Well, there's a sad paper trail, I would say. Paper trail, it starts, at least the one that I saw, starting with George W. Bush, Colin Powell, going all the way up to, leading up through successive administrations until today, in which Senator Leahy is sending letters on a regular basis saying, what about this case in the Leahy Law? What about that case in the Leahy Law? All Israeli cases. And there's just essentially silence on the other end.
That's Tillerson, Pompeo, Colin Powell, all of them, basically is what
Hillary
you're saying.
Clinton.
Wow, Hillary Clinton. Listen, we'll have to stop there. John Kerry. Stephanie Kirsch-Gessner, investigative journalist with The Guardian U.S., and Stephen Rickard at Georgetown University's Law Center. Thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? The United States has always thought of itself as a nation of laws. The law is supposed to matter, and no one is above the law, even presidents. But when it comes to American actions outside its borders, the terrain is just much less legal and a lot more muddy. Let's face it, even when Congress works on legislation meant to demand accountability and support human rights, enforcement's subject to domestic politics. A good example is the Leahy Law, which calls for reviews of America's weapons shipments and reports about their use and abuse. In Israel's war on Gaza, we've watched textbook cases of war crimes, to quote Senator Chris Van Hollen. And yet we can't get the same finding of fact from the U.S. State Department and the Biden administration. This leads to impunity, and that makes the world a much less safe place. And that's the bottom line.